Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Library. On behalf of Deborah Leff, Director of the John F. Kennedy Library, and John Shattuck, CEO of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation, I welcome you to this premiere screening and forum on the search for PT 109. My name is Tom Putnam, and as Director of Education, I want to especially thank our co-sponsor for tonight's event, the National Geographic Society. What a privilege it is for us to host this evening's forum and to have worked with their wonderful staff over the past few weeks on this project. Forums at the Kennedy Library are also made possible through the support of the Lowell Institute, Boston Capital, the Boston Globe, Boston.com, and WBUR. As our museum educators will tell you, few items in our exhibits downstairs capture the imagination of young people more than the famous coconut shell with this inscription: Naro Island, native nose position, he can pilot, 11 alive, needs small boat, Kennedy. Through this one artifact, students are transported to the Solomon Islands and vicariously experience the terror of war, the buoyancy of courage, the munificence of rescue, and perhaps most importantly, come to understand the capriciousness of fate and how a series of individual events off the coast of an island in the middle of the sea can have a monumental effect on the history of our world. All of us, and especially those of us with 7-year-old sons fascinated with stories of past peril in the high seas and the search for shipwrecks and lost treasure, are now indebted to the National Geographic Society and this extraordinary expedition led by Dr. Robert Ballard, the story of which is our subject this evening. On behalf of the John F. Kennedy Library, I want to thank all of you for coming this evening, and it is now my privilege to introduce John Fahey, President and CEO of the National Geographic Society.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thanks for having us here and making your library available for this evening's event. It's a great thrill for me. I've not had a chance to visit the Kennedy Library before, and for the half an hour before this event, we did have a chance to go downstairs and visit the museum. It's a particular thrill because if I look back in my memory and think about what was my first sense of anything political in my life, it was when I was 8 years old and John Kennedy was running for president, and of course he won, and I can tell you it created a great deal of excitement in the Fahey household, being Irish American, and it just was one of those things that gave us, I can't say hope because of course we had lots of hope, but it was really something special for us. So this evening is a nice way to remember that. National Geographic does these kinds of things very often, these sort of explorations, and people often ask, why are you going to try to find a shipwreck? And I think Tom said it before very well. It allows us not only the interest in the exploration itself, but allows us to re-examine the story that was behind it. And that's what this is truly all about. We've done that actually 3 different ways. We've done it through the book, which I think some of you have had a chance to see, and I think Bob Ballard has signed a bunch of these already, and you're willing to after the event as well? Thank you. In this book, and in that magazine article, you all have a December issue of National Geographic magazine. Now, this in itself is an unusual thing. It is the first time in the history of National Geographic that our editors have allowed us to give the magazine to anyone before the first member of National Geographic will receive that December issue, which is not until November 15th. So this is a groundbreaking event, and we hope they will allow us to do it again in the future, but you should enjoy that. But there's an article about this PT 109 find in there, and then, of course, this film this evening that I have had the privilege of seeing already, and this may be a great mistake to create high expectations in advance, but it is a wonderful film, and I think you will truly enjoy it. I'd like to introduce the person who is one of the people responsible for this film, perhaps the person most responsible. He's the executive producer of the film, and he also does a lot of these for National Geographic Television, David Royal. Thank you very much.
It's my great pleasure to introduce for you tonight our film about Dr. Robert Ballard's latest expedition and about those extraordinary events that took place over 3 days in August 1943 in the waters off the Solomon Islands in the South Pacific. Before I introduce you to some of the people who made this film, I'd like to make a few personal remarks. And after I have made them, I think you'll understand why I consider it a great privilege to have been involved in the making of this film and to have an opportunity to tell this story, this remarkable story of character and courage to the American people. Growing up in England, the events of World War II were not distant historical dramas. For many families, they were part of the very fabric of one's life. My own family was full of personal stories of the Second World War. I don't think many people at that time considered themselves extraordinary in any way. They were doing what they felt they had to. It really was a matter of duty. In fact, when President Kennedy was asked whether he considered himself brave to have survived his trial by fire and water, he simply answered, "It was involuntary. They sank my boat." When I was last back in England, I came across a faded telegram from the War Office. It simply said that my Uncle Bran was missing, his bomber last seen in flames over Germany. And along with that telegram were some letters from friends offering hope that he would one day be found. He never was. So you will understand why I found this story of President Kennedy and PT-109 particularly moving. The crew of PT-109 was given up for dead. In fact, there was even a memorial service for them. But President Kennedy himself never gave up. Missing in action maybe, but through his bravery and leadership, he brought nearly all his crew home and saved their families from grief. Among the people who helped us to understand what went on that night are two very special guests that we have with us tonight, Paul Fahey and Jack Keresey. One of Ensign Fahey's early encounters with Lieutenant Kennedy was being chewed out for missing a PT boat training mission, but he more than made up for that, for in the years that followed, he served as Undersecretary of the Navy in the Kennedy administration. Dick Keresey, who sits down there right in front of me right now, a fellow PT boat skipper, was in the Blackett Strait on that very night. He was also part of our expedition out to the Solomon Islands, and he shared so many of his memories with us, and I think made a major contribution to this film. I'm also grateful to Dale Ridder, the distinguished naval historian who is with us tonight, and to Max Kennedy, who represented his family in the Solomon Islands and whose part in this film will become evident to you all. We could never have made the film without the help of Terry Garcia and the National Geographic Expedition Council. Since 1988, the National Geographic Society has supported more than 7,000 expeditions and research projects, from Admiral Peary's expedition to the North Pole, to Jane Goodall's chimpanzee research, to Bob Ballard's discovery of the Titanic. Terry gave us enormous support. I would like to thank Tim Kelly, the president of National Geographic Television, who encourages us to take on projects where the outcome is not always certain, but the striving and ultimate goal is always worthwhile. And Rick Allen, the president of National Geographic Ventures, whose enthusiasm and encouragement in this project was invaluable and whose friendship with the Kennedy family meant that we had a true collaboration and a very worthwhile one. The film you are about to see, The Search for Kennedy's PT-109, was produced and directed by one of our most talented filmmakers, Peter Getzels. Although it is a dramatic story, it was not an easy film to make. There is no archival film to illustrate those 3 days lost at sea. The crew are all sadly no longer with us. The PT-109 itself was not a ship with the grandeur of the Titanic, which was discovered on the ocean floor with the chandelier still swinging in the ballroom. No, the motor torpedo boats, and the Navy has reminded us repeatedly, they are boats, not ships, were largely made of wood, and it was questionable what, if anything, Bob Ballard and Peter's crew would find. But Peter brings an unusual sensibility to his filmmaking. He's actually an anthropologist by training. His previous films have won some of the most prestigious awards in that field, so it's not surprising that when he started work on this film, he approached it partly from an angle that others had paid less attention to. He was determined to tell the story of the Solomon Islanders who had proved heroic themselves. And for the first time since the war, he brought together the two men who rescued President Kennedy and the crew of PT-109. So this, more than anything else, is Peter Getzels' film. But not unlike a motor torpedo boat, a film demands teamwork. And this one greatly benefited from the fine editing of Christine Jameson, the editorial insights of senior producers Margaret Burnett and John Goodman, and from Anne Connanan's contributions that far exceeded those normally expected from an associate producer. After the film, National Geographic Explorer's host, Boyd Matson, will lead a discussion. Now it is our pleasure to show you the search for Kennedy's PT-109. As Senator Edward Kennedy says, to me, it has always been one of the great war stories of all time.
A tribute not only to the people of PT-109, but I think all of the veterans who fought in World War II and have fought for this country since then. I just want to recognize two people who also worked with National Geographic to make this project possible. Mike Morgan, who is the co-author of the book that you have seen, some of you have had signed by Dr. Bob Ballard, is here, as well as Ira Block, who was the photographer who took many of the pictures that are in this book and also, or took all of the pictures that are in this book and also in the magazine article, including, Ira, did you take this picture that's up here on the stage? Okay. This aerial photo, which we will refer to in just a moment, which is key to explaining the story.
I'd like to also thank some very special people in the audience as well. Not only my wife, Barbara, who helped plan and organize the expedition, but the people who made it possible. With all the people that were on the expedition and helped so much, please stand. And there were a lot of people who didn't go on the expedition, but we'll get to them later.
We could have the people who paid for the expedition.
Yes.
Too. Okay.
And we'll be paying for the next one, right?
Well, this was a story that fit very well with the mission of National Geographic. It was first the reason we went out. It was a story of exploration and a story of discovery, looking for a piece of history. And it was also a story that involved technology, the latest means of underwater exploration that Bob Ballard is famous for. But it was also a story of wartime and the sacrifices required of those who fight for their country. And it was also the story of the courage and bravery of one man in particular. And we have representatives of all three of those stories here on this stage. Dr. Bob Ballard, of course, who was responsible for the exploration side and has done that many times for National Geographic, beginning with well, this wasn't his first story, but it probably got him the most fame around the world when he discovered the Titanic, but also the ships that were involved in the battle for Guadalcanal, the Bismarck, the Lusitania, the Yorktown. You know where almost everything is buried in the ocean, probably. Max Kennedy, of course, represents the Kennedy family and that side of the story. But Dick Keresey was the a PT boat commander, PT 105, was there at that time in the same squadron as Kennedy was in, and was also there in that battle that night, as you saw in the story. So I think perhaps we should begin with you on this day, remembering, first of all, had you ever been back to the Solomon Islands before that occasion?
Never been back, and I never wanted to go back. when I went out on the plane from Guadalcanal, that was the one thought I had. I'll never come back here. But I did, and I loved it.
The memories you had of being there at the time, first of all, PT boats may have had this image of being these fast ships and sort of the sexy boats of the Navy, but in fact they were floating bombs made out of plywood and a lot of gasoline. Were you nervous taking those boats through the straits at night in the dark? Did you think about that each night?
Excuse me. They were not floating bombs, were they, Red? They were. No, you've touched a nerve there. The PT boat hull was 2 1-inch mahogany planks laid like that. Mahogany. So there was 2 inches of mahogany in that hull on a framework of oak and other hardwoods. In my mind, they were the greatest wooden boat ever built. So we start there.
You were on a wooden boat. Most of the other fighting boats at the time were heavily armored.
You know, I remember a boat that was right in front of me that must have taken 500 rounds in its gas tanks. It had so much gas in its gas tanks floating around in the bilges that no one could go below because they'd be asphyxiated. And the boat got back. So I'm just not going along with this notion that these were flimsy boats prone to blow up. That's what you read in some of the books, I know. And you'll also read they were made of plywood. They were capable of doing over 40 knots. My boat, I can say the 105, at one point I think was turning up 50 knots. We were running at the time, and I had a boat that was just as scared as I was. I think it was doing 50 knots.
And just describe that night. I've read where looking back at the nautical records, the moon was on the other side of the earth, so it must have been a pretty dark night.
It was dark. I think that's the one thing that in civilian life very few people experience is absolute darkness. There's always a light on somewhere. To understand how dark it was, go up in your bedroom, go in the closet, and close the door. All right? That might give you some idea of what dark is like. We were, the 109 was in the company of 3 other boats, and I was in the company of 2 boats. The 2 boats that I was with were nothing but dark blobs. This happened to be a night when there was not only no moon, there was no starlight. There was very heavy cloud cover. And this was both good and bad. It was good because it protected us somewhat from our worst enemy, which was the Japanese night bomber. That was our toughest and most dangerous enemy. I knew to my misfortune, I lost my executive officer to a bomb. That bomber was attracted to us by our wake, which at any speed was very bright and very phosphorescent, and it pointed at us like a searchlight. And at that point, we were going 27 knots. So whenever we could, we operated at the slowest possible speed because that was the least wake. In fact, some of us, I for one and Jack for another, operated with only our center engine because the propeller of the center engine was 3 or 4 inches farther down in the water. so it showed less wake. And this was a real protection for us not to show that wake, but it also meant most of the time, instead of dashing around at 40 knots, we were doing 6.
Almost idling. Almost idling at times.
Well, idling. We were idling and sometimes stopped. But we usually kept a little way on to keep our course.
Given the type of boats you were using, which meant it was smaller than the ships that you're usually looking for, Bob, and because it was a dark night, and although they knew where the explosion had happened, it wasn't pinpointed as much as some of the wrecks you've gone to look for. So did you go in with confidence when you went out this year?
Well, the thing that caused me to be, I think, overconfident was that we had worked down the slot in Guadalcanal several years before when we went into Iron Bottom Sound, and I thought the geology beneath the ocean would be the same as the geology that I'd encountered further down the slot. There was volcanoes, there were coral. In other words, the land geology was the same, so I just sort of made the assumption that the underwater geology was going to be the same. And so I was drawing on my experience having spent 2 years in Iron Bottom Sound, and I found it to be flat, heavily sedimented, and targets stood out on sonar. They really stood out. Now, yes, they were battleships and heavy cruisers and destroyers, but we even saw in Guadalcanal airplanes on our sonars because they just stood out. So when I can remember going down with Dwight down to Battleship Cove and looking at a real PT boat. And, you know, it's pretty big, actually. I mean, it's 80 feet long, it's 20 feet wide, and it stands a good, from the keel to the top, probably, 12 feet, Dick, wouldn't you say, at least? Yeah. So when you're standing up next to it, it's a pretty big object. And I thought, well, you know, we ought to be able to find this. Now, it had been cut open in some degree, but even if it was cut in half, the pieces were still big pieces. And so I thought, well, you know, they ought to show up, you know. So I thought, well, yeah, we can do this. But then I got up there and I was in for a big surprise.
Well, one thing I know in past ships that you've looked for, you often look for a trail of debris.
Yeah.
Because they're so big, as they sink, they drop things along the way, so you have a much bigger target than just the ship itself.
Right.
There was not much chance this was going to be a big trail of debris, so you had to get lucky.
It didn't. 1,300 feet seems deep to people, but we're used to 16. You know, Yorktown was 17,000 feet. Bismarck was 16,000 feet. Titanic was 12,000 feet. And so it had a lot farther to fall, and that can sort it out and get your debris field. This pretty well, we figured, went straight down, you know. So we were assuming when we went up there, we knew the area. We knew we had a 35 square mile search area, which by our standards is small. Titanic search area was 100 square miles, Bismarck was 150 square miles, and the Yorktown was 300 square miles. So you're looking at 35 square miles. You're looking at much shallower, 1,300 feet. So we sort of, I'd have to say we were sort of cocky that we were going to, you know, be able to do it. But then Dale starts telling us, well, you know, there's nothing there where they collide, the slice theory, you know, and he's hammering home the slice theory, and, you know, that was not something I wanted to hear. You know, I wanted to hear that there was half of it down there waiting for me, because we knew pretty well where the collision took place. We felt that the collision area was 2 to 3 square miles, so a pretty small spot. So we thought, well, we're going to find the piece that got cut off, and then when we got up there and we got some reality check and we got underwater, it was a nightmare, because right next to it is a big volcanic island you saw there, and there's a big coral wall. You could almost go up within hundreds of feet of water and touch the coral. So it was a steep wall, about 600-foot tall wall of coral that was just laying off big blocks as big as PT boats. And when we got into the actual collision area and we turned on our sonar, we went, good luck. You know, there was like 700 PT boats there, you know. And then this constant, you know, well, it's a small piece anyway, so we we started getting real nervous because we knew we didn't have time to look at 700 targets. And so we made a command decision, and that was to give up on the stern and pray that the bow was still in the game. Because if you read your historical database, it said the bow had washed up on the reef near Nauru. It had actually exited Blackett Strait and gone in through Ferguson Passage and then came up onto the beach and then was through time destroyed, and that there was no bow to find. So when we realized there wasn't any stern to find either, we sort of got nervous, and then we went back into the database and started looking at Reginald Evans's logbook, and an interesting thing appeared because he, as you saw in the film, witnessed the collision. He actually thought the PT boats had sunk a barge that night. It turns out it was PT 109. And then he saw it the next morning. In the morning, he reported to Rendova, "I see an object floating in Blackett Strait, drifting down to the south and east." He then reported it later that day. But then the next day, he didn't see it. And then the next day, he didn't see it. It wasn't until the fourth day that he saw this wreckage up on Nauru, and he assumed it was PT 109. Well, I got to thinking, how would he see it? And it's crystal clear. Why would he see it one day, not see it for 2 more days, and then see it on the fourth day? And I got very suspicious of this wreckage, and that's when we talked, when Max and I went and met the scouts who had looked at that wreck, and I was very interested in talking, and they said that they had recovered Japanese rifles. Well, not too many PT boats were carrying Japanese rifles. So I made the assumption that that was not PT 109, and that in fact it had sunk that night. So that shifted the whole battlefield for us further down Blackett Strait, and it turned out down there it was a sandy bottom. So we got lucky.
As soon as you got a sandy bottom, it eliminated a lot of...
Well, there was only one target down there.
You found the one target, and you... Max, how important was this story in family lore?
Thanks, Boyd. I think can I just thank people really quickly?
Oh, sure.
I really want to thank John and thank Rick so much for enabling me to go on this trip, and Ann and Mike and Ira and Mimi, I don't know where she is, for making it so incredible. And I just want to say also that it's a privilege to be on this stage with Dr. Ballard and especially with Captain Keresey. He didn't say it's when you talk about the importance of this wreck, it is very important to my family because we are aware. I think probably it's important to us for 2 reasons, and it's important because we are very aware that it was such a formative experience in the life of an important member of our family who became a not insignificant president of the United States, but also because it's emblematic of the struggle of so many, my Uncle Joe and so many other people who were men and women who were involved in the war. Captain Keresey didn't mention that when his ex, who was one of his closest friends, was killed, they were standing 6 inches apart at the controls of this PT boat running. And when you go out there, as Dr. Ballard says, you start to learn so much about how our country was challenged in the most fundamental ways in the South Pacific, and how we rose to that challenge in a most remarkable way. And that's why it's, I think.
Well, we know that it took a determination to survive, and it took a will to fight for them to make it. And so the story had made it, and obviously everyone in the country knew about it, probably your family more so. But when you actually get to those islands, and you realize the condition the men were in after the PT 109 is basically exploded underneath them. One man badly burned, others injured. And then they have to swim in the dark worried with the Japanese all around.
And
And shoeless. And these are coral reefs, and if you've ever walked on a coral reef, you know what that does to the bottom of your feet. It's just mentioned in the film, and I'm not sure people realize that you actually swam part of that distance. What did that then do to you to explain what they went through and increase your appreciation of their valor?
Well, I have to say that they did that first island was actually quite comfortable. It was very close to the Japanese, really horrifyingly close. You could see the Japanese walking back and forth at their base. And if they'd been captured, they would have been tortured and then horribly killed. But there was a kind of a central place in that island, which was we all thought was quite nice. Make a good place to go camping. But the problem was that is actually where they slept. And the first night, they were so thirsty because they'd been in the water so long. It rained, and they lay and they caught the water coming off of the leaves, which were quite big, and they caught this water all night long, and in the morning they looked, and they were covered with white stuff all over them, and there were birds that were nesting, and they'd been drinking bird poop all night.
They got some nutrition.
And I think that was a big factor in their decision to leave.
So they had some nourishment. Now, which island? You've got the map behind you, so if we can point out, Bob, why don't you take that?
Plum
That's
Pudding, Kennedy Island.
So this is
Plum
Pudding
Pudding Island, Kennedy Island.
Olasana to here.
And then Nauru.
And that's a little more than a mile.
You swam that, didn't you?
Yes, I did. But the remarkable thing
Just show us where you swam on the map.
from here to about there, I would say.
Yeah.
And how long did that take you? And you did it in daylight, of course.
I did it in daylight with no enemy soldiers around, and my friend Bob Nixon, who might have helped me, who was in a canoe with a motor and claims to have swum it now. And, and I mean, with a swimsuit and, I mean, every kind of advantage you could want.
Pass that picture just over to Bob, because I want Bob to point out now what John Kennedy swam the very next night after he gets to the small island.
Well, oops. I don't want to bang your head there. Just to give you a sense.
Now imagine, he's also injured. He has the bad back at this point.
Correct.
He's just drug a guy
and they just swam
with his teeth.
This is Blackett Strait. So Kolombangara, the big volcano, is over here, and this is about 5 miles across. And they were hit closer to the bigger island, but they knew it was full of Japanese. So instead of swimming to the closer island that night, they decided that was not a good idea, to go and try to catch one of these smaller ones, because, see, home base was up there. Rendova was up there. And this is actually, Dick, you want to show them Ferguson Passage? That's Ferguson Passage, and there's another bunch of little islands over about where Dick's Head is. And so this was the narrow strait, and that's how the PT boats entered the game.
But John Kennedy swam from Plum Pudding all the way up to the...
First they swam 3.5 miles to get to the island.
Right. First they had to swim here, then he immediately left them.
And went up to the elbow.
Started walking here. What his hope was to intercept the PT boats coming in the next night. See,
and he swam with a pistol. He was going to fire off there.
And a lantern. He had a lantern. And he started walking. Well, then it hit a big hole. Blunk, but he's walking barefooted over coral.
I just want to ask Dick Keresey, who was the captain of a PT boat, what he would have done if he saw someone with a pistol and a lantern in the water.
We'd open fire. Maybe not. But Jack was up against it, and this was the only chance he had.
This was the only chance he had of intercepting anybody friendly, was to go out into Ferguson Passage and try to get run over by a PT boat and not killed, and enough for them to pause and say, "Who are you?"
As you get the picture, this was a very hopeless situation.
Well, particularly since that night, PT boats went this way. They didn't even go through Ferguson Passage.
And they went back one more night.
And they went back.
And they didn't go through that night either.
They didn't go through that pass again either.
Also, can you show him, Bob, where he spent the night?
Well, he spent it over here on Nauru.
Or no, the one when he spent it on the sandbar.
Right up in here. And some of it's changed through time. You know,
Right. Right.
There was a littler island that's now basically gone. But this one, what we discovered, remember that island full of the snakes?
Yeah.
Sea snakes?
Yeah.
So we're tooling around here, and we go to get on here, and the natives said, don't go there. We said, and the
Bob.
name of the island was
Just your mic.
Sea Snake Island. You know, so it was full of poisonous, toxic sea snakes. And that's right where he went right by. So this was not a good place to wander around.
Yeah, when I swam it, there was a shark came up to me.
Okay, all right, okay.
Okay, we can put the map down.
There we go.
So you can see this was a pretty desperate situation.
No, it's absolutely not a place to be.
And if it hadn't been for the local guys, they probably would not have made it.
Yeah, they'd died of starvation and
So you
Or the
or
Japanese.
being found. But the Japanese would patrol this. In fact, shortly after they swam ashore and just got under cover, a Japanese patrol boat went by.
And Max, what was it like to meet John F. Kennedy on these islands all these years later?
Gosh,
The fact that he had named his son John F. Kennedy.
I really liked meeting Bob and Dick, but frankly, I'll remember for the rest of my life meeting Buku and Ernie, and they were just absolutely remarkable men. And to think that when they were teenagers, they took this on with virtually no training, no armament, and knew that at any time if they were caught, they would be tortured in the most horrible ways and then killed. Not one single member of the Solomon Islands resistance ever turned in an American soldier, even under that torture. Not one.
Since that night, there has been speculation by others who were not there, what they would have done had they been there. Some speculation even that Kennedy was not running the boat correctly to even get run over. Dick, you were there that night. Could it have been avoided, and what would you have done once the boat had been hit?
I was in the same relative position. The PT-105 was in the same
You got to pull that
relative
mic.
position
Yeah.
as the 109, but I was 4 miles further east by myself, about 2 miles off the coast of Kolomangaura, and I'd think that the 109 was at about that same distance. Now, what you have to understand is it was not only dark that night, but that these Japanese destroyers had the great advantage of being up against Kolomangaura, so there was there could be no silhouette. We were against the horizon, and we could be seen in that direction much easier. If you have an object between yourself and a big mountainous island in a very dark night, your chances of seeing anything other than a wake are nil.
Also, PT-109 had no radar.
The big mistake that night, there were 4 boats, the division leader boats, with radar. And the biggest mistake that was made that night was to call back every boat that had fired torpedoes. That was the word that came from the base. After our first encounter, there were 2 encounters, one at 10 when they went with destroyers and one at 2 in the morning when they came out. Well, after the 10 o'clock battle, the base came up and said all boats that had fired their torpedoes returned to base. It so happened that the 4 boats with radar returned to base, leaving us blind. Now, Jack still had his 4 torpedoes. He hadn't gotten in position to fire at all. I I'd gotten in what I thought was a position to fire, and I fired 2 torpedoes, and then I decided it was a bad angle. And I held on to my other 2 torpedoes. And I can tell you, when I heard over the radio, all boats that fired all their torpedoes can come home and go to sleep and go to bed and be nice and comfy, and here I am out there with 2 torpedoes, and I have to stay there. And I did. I had to stay there. But as I say, we were both in the same relative position to Kolomangaara. I spotted around 1:30 in the morning the slight bow wave of one of these destroyers. I don't think it could have been more than 500 yards away, but I have the foggiest notion. And simultaneously with my spotting and firing my last 2 torpedoes, that destroyer fired 1 shot at me. Then he decided, and I think very wisely, that all he would be doing was giving his position away. So it was about a 2-second gun battle and torpedo battle. And I turned and started out. But all I ever saw of that destroyer, except when he fired and lit himself up for a split second, was that little bow wake. If that destroyer had turned in my direction, instead of, as he did about 10 minutes later, he turned in the direction of the 109, the 105 would have been hit and gone down. I have no doubt about that.
Plus, when a boat turns on you, it has the minimum profile, because you're looking just bow on it, so you see even less.
Now, the other thought is we could do 40 knots, but you shouldn't get the impression that, what do they say about the Mercedes and so forth, that can go from 0 to 60
5 seconds.
In five seconds. You get that concept because we had the potential of going 40 knots. But remember, at 6 knots, we're plowing along like a tugboat. Our hull is down in the water and we're pushing. And it took us 3 times as long to go from 6 knots to 10 knots as once we got our stern up to go from 25 knots to 40 knots. We could do that zip, zip. But it was that first part of plugging along to get the bow up and get going that took a long time. I mean, the same thing would have happened to me or anyone else who was in that.
Well, plus they're in a very dangerous area once the sun goes down. They're dead up close to coral reefs. And they don't have really good charts. They don't really know where they are, and they're black and white, and they know that if they're going to hit anything, they want to bump into it. They don't want to hit it at 40 knots. And so they would have been very foolish for a whole myriad of reasons to be going fast.
We want to give, because this is a wonderful opportunity for you to ask some questions, so we have 2 microphones placed here. We'd like to take a few questions from the audience at this point, so you can ask our 3 experts. If you would, try to keep your questions short so we can get a few more of the questions in. And although I know some of you may have stories of your own from World War II, if you just limit it to questions for the 3 guests up here. So if anyone has any questions at this point, come on up to the mic. And Max, why don't you tell us, actually, first of all, I should explain, it was mentioned in the film that the 2 Solomon Islanders had thought they were coming to President Kennedy's inauguration. They got to the airport and they were turned away. That was not by any U.S. government official. That was actually by an official at the Solomon Islands who decided he wanted to come in their place, and so that's why they never ended up in Washington at the inauguration. Because they spoke no English, and he explained that he spoke English, so it would be better if he went.
President Kennedy was extraordinarily irritated by that. That's what I understand. And really, excuse me? Right, and really quite upset. So that was unfortunate.
Well, we are actually doing something. Did you want to?
Can I just say that the sinking of the PT-109 is something that is just vitally important to my family, and I think everybody was really concerned about this, which was the first sort of major undertaking about it in a long time. And I have to say that Peter did just an absolutely beautiful and sensitive job on that film. And will you stand up, Peter? It's just amazing. Thank you.
Why don't we take some questions now? Somebody's at the mic. Go ahead.
I have an appreciation of the darkness under which you were operating, because I happen to be one of today's veterans who was in that same theater. I have read that there may very well have been heavy fog that night, which certainly would add to the complication. How about that?
There was what?
Fog. Was there fog that night also?
No, it wasn't. There wasn't fog. It was just heavy cloud cover and no moon to begin with. So there was no starlight and no clouds. But there wasn't the fog that you might get somewhere else.
Once it gets totally dark, it's hard to know what fog would add to it.
Yeah. I don't remember any fog.
Right. Thank you.
Someone else behind you has a question.
Were you a little upset that the Navy said you couldn't uncover PT-109?
No, in many ways it seemed apropos, because 2 sailors died that night. There's a very good probability one or both were aboard when this boat sank. And it's just, to me, I was very fine with that. Now, I must add that our sonar could penetrate into the bottom. When we did the original search, and our sonar has the ability to go into the bottom, which our eyes cannot do. And what further convinced us what we had found was the object that we could see inside was much larger. In fact, it had the dimensions of the width of PT-109, and the length of the stern section were all of the reflective. See, when a sonar, it has to bounce off of something, and it wouldn't have bounced off the bow very well because there wasn't anything up there. It was wood. But aft, you had the gas tanks, and you had these big engines, and that's what we were seeing with our sonar. So another thing that was important to us was that when right next to the torpedo launcher was a mechanism for cranking out the torpedo when you wanted to fire it. And what we did do is we asked the Kennedy family if we could have permission to grab hold of that mechanism, because what we wanted to do is to see if it would move. If it was just a piece of wreckage, because it wasn't that large, it would be very easy for us to move it around. So we felt that if that was in fact the steering mechanisms, that you swung the torpedo outboard, that if this was really the PT-109 intact, then if we tried to move that, it shouldn't move. And so we did get permission from the family to do that, and we went up to it and we grabbed hold of it and tried to move it, and it was as solid as a rock, which convinced us. Plus, it was right in the right location on the deck where it ought to be. So given all of this data, we knew we'd found PT-109. We were happy with that. But it was the poetic, and for me, that it was mostly buried.
Another question?
Are any of you aware that one of the crewmates on the PT-109 was a Dorchester resident, Bill Johnson?
Yes.
I just thought I'd bring it up. And also, as a teacher, I just want to thank you, Dr. Ballard, because your stories are so interesting to the children. They're brought up all the time, and you certainly are a role model and a hero to this generation.
Well, thank you very much.
Max, do you want to tell what's being done for the? Do you want to tell what's being done for the 2 gentlemen that were involved in the rescue?
Yeah. The 2 scouts still live traditionally, and they're getting older now. Although, God, it looked like Peter made one of them climb a tree for a coconut in that movie, which they expressed a great desire to do, but their sons did it instead. The National Geographic Society and my family are building homes for the two of them that are actual real houses in the villages where they live, which is what, and getting them a little boat with a motor of their own, which is what they've expressed as their great desire. Right now, Biuku lives in a hut which is about the size from me to the closer end of that podium. And there are, if you can believe it, 23 people who live in that hut with him. He said he sleeps outside most nights. So this will be an improvement. So thank you again, National Geographic, for that, which is great. What other production company would do that?
If John F. Kennedy had not become President of the United States, the story of PT 109 might have been lost to history. It would have been filed away on that shelf we reserve for acts of heroism and courageous acts performed routinely by men and women in the U.S. military. But because he did become president, I think it put a face and a name on all of the people involved in the story of PT 109, and it serves to this day as a reminder that the inspiration that they provide, all of those who serve in the U.S. military, all of those who protect our country. And it's also a reminder that this is not a faceless Army and Navy and Air Force out there, and that they are someone's friends and neighbors and husbands and wives and fathers and someone's children, which was summed up, I think, best in a letter from President Kennedy that wrote in 1943, almost 60 years before 2003. And the words ring true to us as we face a lot of the crisis today. And what he said to his parents, he said, speaking as President Kennedy, "When I read that we will fight the Japs for years if necessary and will sacrifice hundreds of thousands if we must, I always like to check from where that person is talking. It's seldom out here. People get so used to talking about billions of dollars and millions of soldiers that the thousands of dead sound like drops in the bucket. But if those thousands want to live as much as the 10 I saw, they should measure their words with great, great care." Words that ring true today. Before we finish, I know everyone wants to leave early this evening. We would like to have Peter Getzels, who is the producer of the film, come up and make a special presentation. Peter.
Peter, the mic.
No, it's not on.
Hello, hello.
Oh, there we go.
I'm thanking National Geographic for the vision to get involved in projects like this, and the Explorer team, and Ann Cananan, who's the associate producer, and Christine Henry Jameson, all the team that was involved in making the film. Now, right there is Biuku's canoe, and that's the very one. We brought it. He built it. Well, his grandsons and grandson and nephew built it. And I really take this as quite a pleasure to be able to present this canoe to the Kennedy family. And it's an item that he really wanted to send. I just want to read his words again. What he said upon completing it was, he said, "I am making this canoe so people in Washington can come and look, so people will hear about the late President Kennedy, so people will remember the story about what happened here. This is my canoe, and I make it for the memorial of JFK, for John F. Kennedy, from Biuku, Gaza." And this was very important for him to send this canoe on, and so here it is. And
Here's my son, Max. I have just a quick gift from my family that I would like to Dr. Ballard can find a mic. I want to, seriously, I want to thank from the bottom of my heart Dr. Robert Ballard for finding PT 109 after 60 years of her being lost, and reminding all of us of the struggles that all of those men went through on that terrible night, and of the good things that came out of it. And thank you very much, Dr. Ballard.
Thank you for joining us this evening. We want to thank Max Kennedy, Dr. Ballard, Dick Keresey for being on the panel and sharing their remembrances of being there in the Solomon Islands from the night that PT 109 sank to the day that it was found. And just as a reminder, Dr. Ballard's book is on sale in the bookstore, so if you hurry, you can get a copy and get him to sign it. And the program, of course, if you want to see this or tell your friends about it, it airs on National Geographic EXPLORER on November 24th. That's a Sunday night, 8 p.m., and it airs on MSNBC. So be sure and check it out again. And thank you for joining us.